This video will look at the Russian Grand Manor House of Ilinskoye as seen by Princess Maria Pavlovna the Younger in her memoir, Education of a Princess. We settled again at Ilinskoye into the routine of country life. Dmitri, my brother, and I always spent our summers there with Uncle Sergey and Aunt Ella, both of whom you can learn about on this channel. They never had any children of their own. Their relations towards each other were distinguished by a strained fondness that rested on my aunt's serene acceptance of my uncle's decision in all matters great and small. Proud and timid, both of them, they seldom showed their true feelings and never offered confidences. Converted after her marriage to the Orthodox religion, my aunt had become each year more devoutly attached to its forms and practices. Although himself pious and scrupulous in observance of all the rites of orthodoxy, Uncle Sergei regarded with anxiety his wife's increasing absorption in things spiritual and ended by regarding it as immoderate. He treated her rather as if she were a child. I believe that she was hurt by his attitude and longed to be better understood, but it was as if she was being driven deeper and deeper within herself for refuge. She and my uncle seemed never very intimate. They met for the first part only at meals and by day avoided being alone together. They slept, however, up to the last year of their life together in the same great bed. My uncle, the Grand Duke Sergei, was possessed of a unique personality and of a character that remained to me to the very day of his dreadful death incomprehensible. The fourth son of the Emperor Alexander II, he was in 1891 appointed by his brother Alexander III as Governor-General of Moscow, and he continued now in this post under the new reign of Nicholas II. It was a position of great power and consequence, and his devotion to his duty was absolute. Even in the country, when he was supposed to be resting, he was constantly receiving couriers from Moscow and giving audiences. From their early youth, Uncle Sergey and my father had been devoted to each other, and my uncle who was also profoundly attached to my mother. The early death which came to her, as I have said, at Ilinskoye, left him with a sense of bereavement for which he could never be consoled. He ordered the rooms in which she had spent her last hours to be kept intact, exactly as they were when she died there. He had these rooms locked, and throughout the remainder of his life himself guarded the key, allowing no one else to enter. He was as tall as my father. Like my father, he had broad shoulders above a body excessively thin. He wore a small beard closely trimmed. His hair, which was thick, was cut short and so brushed as to stand up briskly all over his head. In characteristic posture, he stood erect, head up, chest out, his elbows drawn closely in towards his sides, and with the fingers of one hand he toyed with a jeweled ring that he habitually wore on the little finger of the other. When he was vexed or surly, his lips would be compressed to one crisp straight line, and his eyes became little hard points of light. Cold, inflexible, the world called him, and not without cause, but towards Dmitri and me he displayed a tenderness almost feminine, despite which he demanded of us, as of all his household or following, exact and immediate obedience, the house, the farms, all business affairs, and the least personal detail of our separate lives, he felt it incumbent upon him to direct himself, and to his least decision would permit not the slightest contradiction. Introspective, essentially diffident, his true spirit imprisoned within him, he hid private impulses of exceeding sensitivity, and acted according to rigid conventions, and to conventions royalistic. Those few who knew him well were deeply devoted to him, but even his intimates feared him, and Dmitri and I feared him too. In his fashion he loved us deeply. He liked to have us near him. and gave us a good deal of his time, but he was always jealous of us. If he had known the full extent of our devotion to our father, it would have maddened him. Aunt Ella was an elder sister of the young Empress Alexandra, and one of the most beautiful women I have ever seen in my life. She was tall and slight, of blonde coloring, with features of extraordinary fineness and purity. She had eyes of a gray blue, on one of which was a spot of brown, and the effect of her glance was unusual. Even when in the country, my aunt gave a great deal of time and attention to her appearance. She designed most of her dresses herself, sketching and painting them in watercolor, planning them with care, and wearing them with art and distinction. My uncle, who had a passion for jewels, gave her so many, so she had a different set to harmonize with almost every costume she wore. Throughout our early childhood, throughout, indeed, our uncle's lifetime, Aunt Ella showed no interest in us or in anything that concerned us, and she saw as little of us as she could. She appeared to resent our presence in the household and our uncle's evident affection for us. At times she said things to me that wounded me. I recall one time when she had dressed for an outing and seemed to me particularly beautiful. It was a simple dress of white muslin, but she had her hair fixed a new way, gathered unbound at the back of her neck by a bow of black silk, and the effect was enchanting. I exclaimed, "Oh, Auntie, you look like the picture of a little page in a fairy story." She turned to my nurse without smiling, and spoke in a dry, sharp tone. "Fry, you really must teach her not to make personal remarks." She swept away. Of dressing for dinner she made a veritable ceremony, and one that required much time. The maids, the mistress of the wardrobe, all were assembled. Cambric linen bordered with lace was made ready in a basket lined in rose satin. Wash basins were filled with hot water perfumed with verbena. Rose petals were floated in the bath. Commercial cosmetics scarcely existed in Russia at the time. I believe my aunt had never in her life seen rouge, and she used powder rarely. Painting the face was an art almost unknown to Russian ladies of the day, and to princesses unknown entirely. Aunt Ella made her own face lotion, a mixture of cucumber juice and sour cream. She never permitted the summer sun to touch her skin, guarding it whenever she went out with a silk veil of thick mesh and a silk parasol lined in green. After the maids and other attendants had taken off her outer dress of the afternoon, my aunt would shut herself in her dressing room alone. With the chosen stockings, shoes, petticoats, and all the other complicated apparel of the period arrayed in orderly piles around them, the retinue waited. From the neighboring room could only be heard the splashing of water. Only when my aunt had bathed and put on her corset did she open the door. Then the maids would step briskly forward, each with her special task to perform. While they were dressing her, my aunt would regard herself attentively, usually with pleasure, in a high triple mirror, so arranged that she saw herself from all sides. The final adjustments she made with her own hands. If the costume did not satisfy her in every particular, she had it taken off and demanded another, which she adjusted with the same care and patience. One of the maids dressed her hair. She did her nails herself. They were curiously shaped, very flat and thin and curving forward over the edges of the fingers. Manicuring accomplished, the dress of the evening dawned. Now came my part in the rites. My aunt would tell me the jewels she intended to wear, and I would go to her jewel cabinets, an array comparable almost to the show cases at a jeweler's, and bring her her choice. Soon my uncle, with habitual exactitude, would knock at the door to say dinner was ready. Both of them would kiss me and disappear, and Dmitri and I, having supped early, would be sent to bed. One evening, I remember, in those early days, I saw my aunt in court dress, majestic with her sweeping train of brocade, ablaze with jewels, and resplendently beautiful. Mute before the spectacle, I raised myself to the tips of my toes and placed a kiss full of devotion on the back of her white neck, directly under a magnificent necklace heavy with sapphires. She said nothing, but I could see her eyes, and the cold, hard look in them chilled me to the heart. Only once in those early years did I see her face with her eyes unguarded. Taken with diphtheria, I lay desperately ill, with a fever of 104 degrees, at Ilinskoye. I dwelt in a laughing world of fantasy, a world that distracted me from my sufferings and kept me occupied as in a storybook. Always before my eyes were bright, charming pictures, which I followed interestedly in my drowsy mind. Cracks and spots on the ceiling, after I watched them for a while, turned into designs and cameos, with soft gray backgrounds of an infinite variety. It was now a chateau with towers and drawbridges over a moat filled with water. A cavalcade left the gates. I saw the knights with falcons on their wrists, and Amazons in long dresses, their trains trailing on the ground in the dust. Then it would be a lake, on which light barks floated. I saw the contour of islands, with tall trees and clouds that passed across the sky. Once it seemed I saw a high grill, behind which was a magnificent palace and a beautiful garden of flowers. The cretonne of the curtains presented fantastic subjects. All that I saw was so lively and so lovely I did not want anyone to come near me. At the approach of any human being the visions disappeared, and after such delicious daydreams any moments of lucidity were full of pain and sorrow. At night I slept little and badly. My head was heavy, my throat constricted, and there was buzzing in my ears that seemed to come from a swarm of invisible flies. At one side, in the playroom, a night-light burned, and from time to time a white shadow approached my bed. Once, on hearing the sound of steps, I looked between half-opened lids and saw my aunt bent over me. Her expression astonished me. She was watching me with mingled curiosity and anxiety. It was the first time in my life I had seen her face relaxed and natural. It was as if I had penetrated indiscreetly into the interior of her soul. I moved. Her face was again as it had always been. It was years before I was again permitted to see her unmasked. The most beautiful, the gayest memories of my childhood attached to Ilinskoye. It is to me the land in which Dmitri was born and where we grew up together. It is our little country in the immensity of all Russia, and it will always remain the strongest bond uniting me to our native soil. It was a property of little more than 2,400 acres, bordering the Moskva River, about 40 miles from Moscow. It had nothing that belongs to those magnificent estates which so many great Russian families possessed before the disasters of the Revolution. It was modest, and perhaps on that account its charm was greater. My uncle inherited Ilinskoye from his mother, the Empress Marie, who used it in her later years as a retreat from the fatigues and ceremonies of court life. The house was square and of old oak. It was small, with few rooms, and had neither style nor pretension. Cottages were scattered throughout the park for guests and persons of the suite. The park was the chief charm of the place. It bordered the river by some distance, cut by drives. The place brought in no income. Uncle Sergey spent, on the contrary, a great deal of money to maintain it. Each year there was a new caprice. He had prize cattle brought in, a special breed of a bright beige color from Switzerland. I have never seen them anywhere else. He liked fine horses, and organized an Ardennes stud, the only one in Russia. He was always having something built, this year a new school for the children, the next an extension of the greenhouses. The farm had a magnificent herd of Holstein cattle, and elaborate poultry houses in which my uncle took a special interest. There were orchards and vegetable gardens and entire fields of flowers cultivated for the house. My uncle's suite and household were so numerous that each settling down at Ilinskoye for the summer resembled the migration of an entire village. When we organized fetes for the children, we had always to plan for more than 300. My aunt had 3 women and 1 dressmaker just for her personal service without counting the maids. All these people were watched over by a mistress of the wardrobe. It was her duty to see the apartments were kept in order, to engage serving women, to do the buying and shopping, to pay the bills of dressmakers and modistes, and to keep the keys of the jewel boxes. My uncle had 3 or 4 valets who worked in relays of a week each. The male personnel, footmen, dishwashers, lamplighters, and so forth, were under the orders of a chief steward. The stable, with its coachmen, grooms, ostlers, was entrusted to a man who did nothing else. The railway station by which one came to Ilinskoye was called Odinzovo, and from the moment you stepped on the small landing in front of the station, you were struck by the special air. The coachman of our carriage, askew on the seat, would be there, gathering in one hand the numerous reins by which he drove his span of 3 horses, with the other lifting his little round felt hat, gay with peacock feathers. Over his white silk shirt he wore a sleeveless garment of dark blue cloth, pinched to his figure, and a wide belt of white wool, the ends of which floated over his knees. When we were seated in the carriage he replaced his hat. His hair was cut to the nape of his neck and carefully oiled. He spread his arms, waved the reins. The horses started. They crossed the station enclosure and the little village at a walk. Then our coachman, leaning forward a little, urged them into full speed. The horse in the middle trotted, balancing his great collar. The other 2 galloped at each side, head down, neck rounded. From their carriage you saw their shining rumps, their manes, and their long tails flying through the dust, raised by their hooves. Harness bells tinkled gaily. The straight, sandy road passed by fields. The wheat, still green, was as high as the carriage. A warm breeze stirred the wheat in long waves. After traversing a pine forest, the carriage came out onto a vast meadow, from which beyond the river sunk between its banks and still invisible, you perceived the roof of Ilinskoye drowned in the crests of trees. At the end of the meadow the coachman slowed down cautiously to cross a wooden bridge which was, because of frequent floods, a floating structure. Hooves resounded on the planks, and the horses breathed noisily. Slowly now we traversed the village. Dirty children, in small shirts, inadequately cut to their stature, played in the dust. Before the tavern stood peasant teams, tied to a trough hollowed out of a tree trunk. The short grass in front of the houses was matted with mud and trampled down by animals. At the left there was a church with a green roof, and just beyond the wide wooden gates of Ilinskoye, opened to receive us. The coachman now turned slowly, in order not to lock the wheels with the posts of the entry, and we penetrated into a magnificent alley of 4 rows of immense lime trees. At its end was the house, bathed in the sunlight. My uncle, leaning on the balcony above the entrance, smiled at us. The coachman, with one movement of his elbows, sharply brought the 3 horses to a stop. Servants in white livery came down the steps to help us descend. They were all pleased to see us again. They considered us the children of the house, and in the shadows of the vestibule, damp and close with the sweet smell of flowers, my uncle took us tenderly into his arms. "At last you're here," he said, giving his hand to our governess, who curtsied. "Come to your rooms." Down a long corridor he led us into a large room, our playroom, which opened onto a little terrace. A sweet freshness reigned in this room, protected from the rays of the sun by the large 2nd-story balcony. I had the 2 rooms to the left of the playroom. Dmitri had the 2 rooms to the right. As we chatted to Uncle Sergey, trying to tell him everything at once, our aunt would appear and calmly lean to embrace us as we seized her hands to kiss them. Even towards her, at these moments of reunion, our hearts overflowed, and we did not doubt this house was as much ours as if it had been our own. Our uncle wished it so, and our aunt came in time to accustom herself to the idea. Every morning before breakfast we made a tour of the farm with my uncle. We stopped first at the stables and drank a glass of warm milk, fresh from the cow. Then we would go to see the chickens, gravely walking around their enclosed yards, and take with us fresh eggs, which had been saved for us. After the promenade, we generally took our coffee on the big balcony. Here our aunt came to join us after an hour of walking alone. My uncle read his newspaper, and my aunt English pictorial reviews or French fashion magazines. She cut out of them whatever pleased her or caught her attention, and collected these pictures in albums for use in designing her wardrobe. After this, lessons began and lasted until 11. Released, we generally sought the shade of trees or the banks of the water for our playing, and when we were bigger we went bathing. On the river bank we had a little cabin of our own among the reeds. It only contained one room, worm-eaten, and slippery steps led into the water. We undressed in turns and went down to the river, which was neither clear nor deep. At the right end of the cabin there was a sort of beach of fine sand. Here the village cattle stretched themselves out in the sun. From the beach came the lowing of cows, the bleating of sheep, and the cries of the village children who went in bathing with their beasts. In these cries heard afar I find again all the atmosphere of Ilinskoye in summer. When I close my eyes on a hot day in July, it seems to me I can still hear them. After the bath, we made haste to return to the house to get ourselves ready for lunch, for my uncle held to a rigorous schedule in these matters, and the delay of a minute would bring remarks down upon us and even punishments. We ate a great deal, and moved for our coffee either on to the terrace adjoining the dining room or to my aunt's balcony. At the table I was seated beside my uncle, and Dmitri was placed near me. If there were guests, one of them was always my neighbor, and my uncle paid attention to my conversation. I was severely reprimanded and punished if I did not find something to talk about. At our luncheons there were never fewer than 15 or 20 people. They were the most painful moments of the day for us. The coffee finished, my uncle took himself off to his room for a siesta. He took his nap stretched out in an armchair, his legs upon another chair covered with newspaper, so that it might not be soiled by his boots. My aunt went down to the garden and established herself within the shadows of a covered terrace where it was always cool. Here she would do a little painting, or have someone read to her aloud while she and the ladies did embroidery. The things they read must have been childish, for I will never forget the difficulties my aunt had with recollections of a dead house, her first attempt to appreciate Dostoevsky. She did not know enough Russian to read it herself. One of the ladies read it aloud to her, and so great was my aunt's fear of details too realistic that she would permit no one to attend these readings. She had no admiration for French literature. Once she said to me, apropos of a person whose life she found somewhat frivolous, that it was French novels with yellow covers that corrupted her ideas. At this period she read only English books, and chose her authors with great caution. Before retiring to his room after luncheon, my uncle would have given orders as to how the afternoon should be employed. This he decided entirely by himself, never consulting my aunt. We children had several pairs of ponies and mules. Uncle Sergey always indicated exactly which animals should be harnessed and to which carriages. Occasionally it happened, for one reason or another, that his orders could not be executed at the last moment, and as no one dared disturb him during his nap, my aunt took it upon herself to alter the arrangements. When my uncle found out, he would be angry, and made sharp remarks to my aunt. During his sleep the house was plunged into a deep silence. Only towards late afternoon did life begin to run its course again. Then one heard horses pawing the ground in front of the house, the wheels of the carriages grating, and bells tinkling. Dmitri and I would go out with our mules in a small, low carriage of pleated rushes, accompanied by a master of the stables. We disputed over the pleasure of holding the reins, and when we had them between our hands, would not give them up easily. Occasionally my uncle went with us, then we had to behave. We sometimes drove to take tea and cakes with neighbors, especially with the Yusupovs, always great friends of our family. They had 2 sons, Nicholas and Felix, who would become so famous as the assassin of Rasputin, older than us by some years. Such excursions were frequent in summer, but in autumn they often could not be made because of the roads, which were impracticable for large carriages in bad weather. We always took the same routes. They grew so familiar that we could have described each peculiarity of them. The landscape was everywhere the same, plain but smiling. Vast fields of wheat, meadows covered with a sweet tufted grass, with bellflowers and daisies, forests of pine, oak, birch, and a few villages always looking alike, with their wooden hovels. When the berries were ripe in midsummer, we went to pick them in the depths of the big park, and after rain we went hunting for mushrooms. We knew every corner where they grew. Mushrooms were so sought by the peasants it was necessary to guard the parks, as if they were private hunting grounds. In spite of all the threats, the temptation of mushrooms was too strong. In the copses we could see the colored handkerchiefs of women and hear them run away at our approach. The weather was always the same, dry, calm, and beautiful. But terrible storms broke sometimes, followed by a day or two of almost tropical rain. These storms came upon us especially at night. The house would be shaken by terrific bursts of distant thunder. Terrified, unable to sleep, too proud to call the nurse who slept at my side, I would leave my bed, draw near the window, raise the blind, and peep out. Then lightning came, sharp and white, and rending a sky suddenly green, and immediately after obscurity intense, fearful. The darkness, the tense sense of waiting for the storm to break, became more and more agonizing. It was as if all over the earth catastrophe impended. Finally, the first drops of rain came, striking through the foliage, splashing loudly, heavily to the ground. The air grew less heavy. Soon the rain was a deluge. In the dark, I could hear little brooks forming at the ends of rain spouts. In the lightning, I saw against the greenish sky the tormented silhouettes of trees. Next day, as a rule, the sky was again serene, and the air held a special flavor, light and delicious. The newly washed leaves shone, the grass was wet, the water in the river troubled, and the sand of the paths streaked with small furrows. From time to time there were fetes to break the charming monotony of our existence. The 5th of July was my uncle's name day, St. Sergei's. That day he organized a lottery for the peasants and the personnel of the estate. Guests, arriving for the most part the night before, filled the little summer houses in the park. In the morning everyone went to Mass. A luncheon followed, attended by the parish clergy, the district authorities, and neighbors. After lunch the lottery was drawn. This ceremony took place in a field. The heat was intense. Great clouds of dust floated over the motley crowd. A military orchestra played waltzes and polkas. My uncle, elegant and fresh in his white summer tunic, went among the crowd, now talking with one, now another. No guest dared return to the house before my uncle gave them the signal. When the last lot was drawn, my uncle and my aunt, followed by their friends, took the path to go back, and it was with a sigh of relief that the poor women let themselves fall into the wicker armchairs surrounding the tables where tea was served under the trees. It was a very fatiguing day for everybody. Towards the end of July came St. Elias's Day, a parochial holiday, and at the same time the festival of our village. Several days in advance, itinerant merchants built booths along the principal street. The fair lasted 3 days. They planted pikestaffs for the merry-go-rounds and swings, and put up tents for traveling shows and photographers. Peasants came from afar in their carts and wagons. After Mass, Uncle Sergey opened the fair, and immediately after lunch we went down to make purchases. My uncle and aunt felt obliged to buy from each merchant, even the most modest. They began their rounds, my uncle on one side, my aunt on the other, continued to the end, met, and began over again. Servants walked behind them, carrying enormous baskets, which filled rapidly. The merchandise was of no great variety, from year to year, and always the same: linens, printed calicoes, handkerchiefs, shawls, earthenware, glassware, ribbons, sweets. It was customary to make gifts, but difficult amid this confusion of perfectly useless objects. Sometimes, however, you chanced upon amusing things that you snatched away from the merchant's hands, now a carafe with a colored bird blown inside, now an enormous lemon preserved in alcohol. There were tobacco boxes in enameled papier-mâché with portraits of the emperor and empress, or of my uncle and aunt, and large cups decorated with droll paintings, charades, or caricatures. Dmitri and I were given money to buy presents and souvenirs for everybody, including the servants, and we too had to visit the majority of the booths and all the attractions, which amused us much more. Bands of curious children followed us from stall to stall. We bought enormous bags of caramels, sunflower seeds, and peanuts, throwing them to urchins who fought like small dogs to catch them. In the evening after dinner we returned to the fair and rode on the merry-go-round by the light of grease pots and candles stuck in bottles. The crowd was as thick as by day. It became generally rowdy under the influence of drink, and we returned early to the house. The night air carried faintly up to us the sound of accordions, the sticky voices of peasants, and the strident laughter of women. Towards the middle of August we always left Ilinskoye and moved across the river to Osovo, where the heating arrangements were more modern. The house at Osovo, built by my uncle of brick and grey stone in the English manner, was not pretty, but it was spacious and comfortable, and there was a large winter garden forming all of one wing, and filled with flowers and tropical plants. Moving into Osovo represented the last stage of our summer, the last weeks of vacation. The days became shorter, the park trees lost their leaves, and the birds flew away. The air turned sharp, and the grass was so often covered with frost in the morning. Then we would go into the woods hunting nuts, and bring them back in sacks, but soon there was nothing more for us to do. The fruits and the berries were all plucked, the mushrooms gathered, and all that remained was walking down damp paths, yellowed with dead leaves, under the almost naked trees.